Cornwall today is known as a beautiful, if remote county of England, filled with tourists flocking to see its white sands and impressive cliffs. But peel back the layers of this land, and you find a distinct language and culture with its own identity that still clings on to this day. Go one layer deeper, and you uncover a bloody history of a once mighty kingdom, rich in lore and myth, and a tragedy of isolation, desperation, and defeat at the hands of hostile invaders. Join me in the first episode of this new series where we dive into the history behind campaigns, as we travel to the last days of an independent Cornwall and trace its path towards dissolution. The etymology of Cornwall can provide important details about its location and its downfall. The corn part of the name comes from the Proto-Celtic word carnos, which means horn, which refers to the shape of the peninsula. There may also have been a Brythonic tribe in the area called the Cornovi, who got their name from the same root. Cernow, the name for the area in the Cornish language, also comes from the same Proto-Celtic origin. The wall part does not refer to a constructed wall, but rather comes from the Old English Welch, which means foreigner, Romano-Briton, and sometimes slave. Indeed, this is the same etymology as Cornwall's Brythonic brother, Wales. Cornwall was also sometimes called West Wales in Anglo-Saxon records. The origin of Cornwall in English tells us about its situation in the late Iron Age. The Cornish were being pushed almost into the sea by the invading Anglo-Saxons, who viewed them as foreigners despite being the invaders themselves. Their peninsular home serving almost as a prison, where they awaited their eventual destruction. However, we must be careful in drawing too strict a demarcation between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxon invaders are unlikely to have perpetrated a genocide against the local Britons, and there are many suggestions for continued cultural acceptance and connections, with many Brythonic place names surviving into the present day, and even some West Saxon kings having names with Brythonic roots. Nevertheless, Cornwall would be subsumed by the Anglo-Saxons, through one means or another. At the time of the Roman departure from Britain, the Cornish were still thriving. The tin and silver trade, which had connected Cornwall to wider Europe since the Bronze Age, ensured its place on the map. But more convenient sources from within the Roman Empire saw exports diminish. Cornwall proper was mostly untouched by the Romans, and native socio-economic systems continued through the Roman period. The lands of the Dumnonia tribe, where the later kingdom of Dumnonia of Arthurian fame would be focused, saw a greater Roman presence, with an important provincial capital being established at Dumnoniorum, modern-day Exeter. West of Exeter, there is little Roman impact, with the extent of Roman sites being 3 forts at Tregear, Lostwithiel and Calstock, and a Roman villa near Camborne. One important phenomenon seen during the Roman period in Cornwall is increased connections across the Channel to Brittany, first through trade and later through migration. This cross-channel movement increased after the Romans left Britannia, exacerbated by the aggression of the Anglo-Saxons. The emigration weakened the kingdom of Dumnonia, of which Cornwall was a part, leaving it vulnerable to Anglo-Saxon attack. The Angles, Saxons and Jutes began arriving in Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries, first as raiders and mercenaries, and then as settlers and conquerors. Soon, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had spread across what is now England, leaving Dumnonia as one of the few remaining Brythonic kingdoms, and the Kingdom of Wessex expanding rapidly towards it. Decades of expansion by the West Saxons at the Britons' expense led to the first decisive defeat over a combined force of Romano-Britons at the Battle of Deorham in 577. The Winchester manuscript of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states in its entry for 577, "Here Cuthrina and Cheolin fufton with Bretas, and here 3 Kuningas of Slogon, Coinmail and Condedan and Farinmail, and there astod estis Quaid and Deorham, and Yenamon 3 Cheastro, Gleowanchester, and Keranchester, and Bathanchester. Here Cuthwena and Cheolin fought against the Britons, and they killed 3 kings, Coinmail, Condidan, and Farinmail, in the place which is called Deorham, and took 3 cities, Gloucester, Cirencester, and Bath. The loss of these 3 important Roman settlements was a devastating blow to Dumnonia, and secured the continued rise of Wessex and its expansion westward. Perhaps the most important effect of the battle, however, was the separation of Dumnonia from the rest of the Brythonic kingdoms, leading to greater isolation and perhaps causing the divergence of Welsh and Cornish. Dumnonia was now left to fight the Saxons alone, and the 7th century saw continuing expansion by Wessex into Devon and Somerset. According to the 13th century Florus Historiarum, the Dumnonians still held Exeter in 632. 20 years later, however, the Dumnonians were defeated by Cornwall of Wessex at Bradford-upon-Avon, and again at Peonnum in 658 or 660, which saw the loss of Glastonbury and the movement of the Dumnonian West Saxon border beyond the River Parrett in Dorset. After this, however, attacks from Mercia slowed the West Saxon advance west, giving the Britons some respite. At the start of the 8th century, Cornwall remained a part of the Kingdom of Dumnonia, but would soon emerge as a separate kingdom. The fate of Dumnonia is elusive, though. Thomas Charles Edwards highlights the description of the Battle of Herhill, a victory for the Britons, in the Annales Cambriae, wherein Cornishmen are mentioned, but not Dumnonians. He suggests that by this time Dumnonia had fallen, and this Cornish victory allowed it to survive that kingdom's downfall into the 9th century. Other historians, however, suggest that Dumnonia survived into the 9th century. Either way, by the early 9th century, the territory of the Britons in the peninsula had been reduced to what we now associate with Cornwall today. The major driver of this was the West Saxon king Ecgberht, who is often pointed to as starting Wessex's rise as an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, which would result in his descendants unifying England. In 814, it is recorded that he ravaged Cornwall, and by 822 all of Devon had been annexed to Wessex. Arthur's kingdom of Dumnonia was no more, and Cornwall was the last bastion of independent Britons in England proper. West Saxon domination over Cornwall was assured in the Battle of Gafulforda in 825, and in the same year the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Ecgberht disposed of their territory as it seemed fit to him, giving a 10th part of it to God. This brought Cornwall into the West Saxon ecclesiastical system, reducing its independence further. What was left of the Cornish kingdom carried on under the overlordship of Wessex, with more and more of its land being given away to Saxon nobles. The last battle between Wessex and Cornwall took place in 838 at Hingston Down, on the border between Devon and Cornwall. The Cornish, seeking to remove the Saxon shackles, allied with Danish Vikings to attempt to oppose the West Saxons. But they were easily defeated by the might of the powerful Ecgberht, and Cornwall's place as a subject of Wessex was secured. As the 9th century continued, West Saxon influence increased, and Cornish independence drastically reduced. Alfred the Great hunted openly in Cornwall in 865, as if it were any other part of his realm. The Cornish Bishop of Bodmin submitted to the West Saxon Archbishop of Canterbury in 870. The last recorded king of Cornwall was Dungarth, who appears in Crusader Kings 3. He attempted to gain the alliance of the Vikings who are harrying West Saxon Devon, but this only led to tragedy. In Irish documents, it is said that Dungarth was drowned in 875, either accidentally or as a punishment for collaborating with the Vikings. His death may have occurred in the River Fowey near Bodmin Moor, where a stone dedicated to him lies, the last remnant of this Cornish king, and the last monument of an independent Cornish kingdom. With the drowning of Dungarth, Cornwall was drawn more closely into Wessex, the final tragedy of the Dumnonians. Cornwall would continue to be integrated into Wessex, and later England, with the first king of England, Æthelstan, forcibly removing the Cornish from their ancient seat of Exeter and firmly bringing Devon into England. It is here that we see the tragedy somewhat turn around. Whilst Devon would become significantly anglicised, Cornwall retained its distinct culture and language, resisting the social influences of the Anglo-Saxons, despite succumbing politically. Cornwall remained a distinct part of Anglo-Saxon England, with Edmund I of England styling himself King of the English and ruler of this province of the Britons. Descendants of the kings of Cornwall would also continue to rule as earls until the Norman conquest, the great watershed of English history. The history of Cornwall is bittersweet in many ways. Though much of its history was spent on the back foot, there are glimmers of a strong, unified nation. Despite it all, however, the Cornish identity remained, and still flickers on today. Ironically, the Cornish managed to outlive their Saxon oppressors, who were eventually assimilated into the Norman French. The legacy of the Cornish and Dumnonians remains across the Channel in Brittany as well, which has its own unique history and identity. The Cornish peninsula is also the land of Arthur, the best known protagonist from Brythonic culture, and a hero now of all England. In the end, Cornwall never died, and impacted English history and culture more than we might expect. So, I hope you've enjoyed this overview video on the last centuries of Dumnonia and Cornwall. The idea behind this series is to provide a historical backdrop to my other videos, so expect to see more similar videos soon. If you have enjoyed, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments below your thoughts on this format. I have been the Holy Roman Duck Lord. See you later.